Hey expats and travelers, this is Josh with Expats Everywhere, and today I sit down with Tyler. He's an expat that moved to rural Spain, and he talks about the cost of living there, what it was like adapting to life in rural Spain, and then also how is it with the language. Without further ado, let's sit down and talk to Tyler.
My name is Tyler. I'm originally from Central Texas, a town called Harker Heights, not to be confused with Austin. Very different culture. And it was for that reason, growing up in this place, which was really void of culture in a lot of ways, that as soon as I was able to, I set off and started traveling. And that's actually what led me to your channel, introduced me to Expats Everywhere. I'm always interested to hear about more international opportunities, and I think you and your wife do a great job of presenting those.
Oh, thanks, man. We appreciate that. Did not expect to hear that, but that's really awesome. We appreciate it. Well, if you could tell us what you were doing before you moved to Spain.
Yeah, so for the past year and a half, I've been teaching English in Spain on a program called the Auxiliares de Conversación. It's a English language assistant program. Prior to that, I had a pretty turbulent 20s. I tried a lot of different things for short amounts of time, and that all started because my childhood dream, my idea of happiness, of having an office job, having a good salary and a nice apartment and nice things, didn't provide the happiness that I had always expected. So after my first office job out of college is when things got interesting. And as I said, I dabbled in a lot of different things. I started as a snowboard instructor. I taught English in South Korea. I spent a summer working in Alaska, did some backpacking around Europe and Asia as well. And after years of this very exciting but also exhausting period of my life, I decided that I wanted to try something new, and that new thing was not going to be just another country to add to my list, but rather investing in something. And that's why I moved to Spain. I wanted to try something a little more long term, but not necessarily a full-fledged career.
Right on. Well, what made you feel like Spain was the right place?
I've always been attracted to places with mountains, and prior to coming to Europe the first time, I had never considered visiting Spain. I think growing up in Texas, my only experience with Spanish was with Mexico, and not that Mexico's not interesting, but as Americans, we're kind of told that Mexico's dangerous. It's not really a place to go and live, which I as I've traveled and done more things internationally, Mexico has actually become a very attractive destination.
That's right.
When I finally did make it to Europe, I went to France. I was a bit of a Francophile growing up, and I had these romantic notions of what France would be, and in many ways it lived up to those expectations. But I purchased a one-way ticket to Paris. I spent a month working on a couple different farms in France, and I was in this rural area of the Pyrenees, and I basically just needed to get back to a major hub, a major city, so that I could fly back to the States. And there was no public transportation in this area, but my host recommended that I catch a BlaBlaCar, which is a ride-sharing service I've never heard of, down to Barcelona. And that's how I ended up in Spain the first time. And I fell in love with the country first for its geography. I'm sure you've spent some time in Barcelona. Having access to both mountains and the beach was extremely appealing to me, and ended up spending about 3 weeks in the country that first trip, and I just kept coming back. Over the years, I took 3 trips in total prior to moving here.
Oh, okay. Well, so what happened when you started to take the move a little more seriously? What steps did you take? Were there some critical things that you did to make the move a reality?
Yeah, as I'm sure you're familiar with, the visa process can be pretty intimidating. I've done the visa process in 3 different countries now, and there are some pretty standard steps. You know, you have to get a background check, you have to make an appointment at a consulate, and the process can move slowly. And it moved especially slowly for me because I was doing it all during that first wave of the pandemic. But once you commit to doing something like this and you become organized, you know, you keep a checklist of the things you have to do, it does start to feel a lot more obtainable. And even though there were some hiccups along the way, I never felt like it wasn't going to happen.
Okay, well, so if you could, we know that it's a little more difficult for Americans to get European visas to live. So what kind of visa did you get, and how daunting was that process?
Yeah, I took a look in my passport to see if it had a name. I'm not exactly sure what the actual visa is called, like what the code is for it or anything, but you're entirely right. It is difficult for Americans to move to Europe, but it's not at all impossible. Um, I talked about the geography that attracted me to Spain initially, but it was also this program, the Auxiliares de Conversación, the English language assistant program that drew me in because it's one of the only ones in Europe. So the visa that I got, it was not provided by the program, but the program acted as a sponsor for me to apply
Right.
for the visa. Yeah. And it's not a great visa by any means. It's for 8 months at a time. It's a student visa, so you don't have the rights of citizens or anything along those lines. But it's a gateway. It gets you into Europe, and that for a lot of people is the goal.
Right on. Well, I think unlike a lot of content that's out there on Spain, that's mainly in the cities, you're living in a rural part of Spain. So what made you want to move there?
As I said, I did a fair amount of travel during my mid 20s, and I'd gone to the big cities, but it was always when I left the cities, when I went to smaller towns or more rural regions, that I felt like I got a more valuable experience. So when it came time to apply to Spain, I kept that same mentality in mind. And I'd actually met a friend when I was teaching in the Czech Republic, which is what I did immediately prior to moving to Spain, who had taught English in Cáceres, which is the one of the main cities in the comunidad or province of Extremadura. And she raved about it. She
Nice.
said, yeah, she promised that I would be forced to speak Spanish every day, which was something I was looking to do. And she told me about her €100 a month apartment that was 1 block from the town square. And it sounded really appealing. And I don't think she oversold it. It has proven to be true.
Okay, that's brilliant. Well, were there any things that you needed to adapt to life there in rural Spain?
If you want to be happy in rural Spain, you have to accept that you are in rural Spain. And you can't you can't expect things to run as quickly or as efficiently as they would, for example, in the States or in an American
Yeah.
city. The rural Spanish life it's a leisurely one. It's about enjoying good food, good wine, and good company, and there's really no hurry to do anything. So if you are someone with a very entrepreneurial spirit or someone who really likes to get after it, you sort of have to, you can still push yourself, but there are certain instances where you have to be understanding and adapt to the world around you. You can't expect those people to change their way of life. So it can be frustrating at times.
Okay, you touched on this earlier. You said €100 for an apartment. Do you find that to be normal? And how much is that good food and that good wine?
Funny thing about where I live, Placencia, it's not a large town. It has about 40,000 people, whereas Cáceres is more of a hub. It has about 120,000 people.
Okay.
Placencia is actually more expensive. I think that's because there's just not as much availability. A lot of the buildings are very old. Some of them are in ruins. So there's just not as much vacancy, and it's a simple situation of supply and demand. So my apartment, I'm not actually in it today, but it's a 2-bedroom place. I believe it's 94 square meters, which still doesn't really compute for me as an American.
It's about 1,000 square feet. Yeah.
That sounds about right. Yeah, pretty big place, lots of light, renovated just last year. Very modern, it's nice. It's built into the Old Town Wall, which I think is really cool. I'm a
That is
big
cool.
history buff. Yeah, and I split it with someone. We pay €275 each. So my friend who paid 100, she had a room in a 4-bedroom place that she was sharing with students.
Got
so
it.
those places do exist.
Yep.
As for food and drink, as I'm sure you're aware, tapas culture is a brilliant way to go out and spend an evening of drinking, socializing, and snacking. In Extremadura, where I live, when you order a drink, for example, a glass of wine will run you about €2.40. Every single time you can expect a tapa, which is a small plate of food, to be included with that for free. So, I mean, it's pretty spectacular.
Real quick, what are some of your favorite tapas?
Some of my favorite tapas, you can't go wrong with tortilla de patatas. Love huevos rotos. Yeah, I typically keep it simple. In Extremadura, they have excellent jamon, so that's a go-to as well.
All right, so jumping back into the whole transition to rural life in Spain, did you find anybody or anything particularly helpful during this transition period?
I have different schools this year. I had 2 schools last year and 2 schools this year, and as part of the program, there's a head teacher at each school who's typically appointed to be sort of your welcoming guide. They're supposed to help you through the visa process, because that doesn't stop. Once you've arrived in Spain, that's just the beginning. There are still multiple more trips to the foreign police office. And I wasn't so lucky last year. I was kind of thrown into the fire. I did have a Spanish flatmate, so she helped me open a bank account last year, which I've recently learned was because she got a bonus for signing up someone to her bank. but nevertheless, I'm thankful for her time. I did pretty much everything on my own, and as time has gone on, these days I do everything on my own, and it has forced me to grow. I'm very grateful for that. If I'd had someone to lean on, as I did in Korea, for example, or in the Czech Republic, I probably wouldn't have learned nearly as much Spanish as I have.
So what's been the most difficult part of trying to settle into Extremadura?
Yeah, the most difficult part is the lack of public transportation. I'm from Texas, everything's very far apart, and I started driving the day I turned 16, and I drove every single day. So moving to Europe, I've learned to rely on public transportation, but in Extremadura, the public transportation is very limited. I like to have a base, but I also like to get out and explore different areas, and that has been pretty tough to do in Extremadura. So I'd say that's the most difficult aspect. I know you're living in Portugal now. I just made it to Portugal for the first time in November after 15 months of living in Spain, and I'm 45 minutes from the border.
Right. Well, during these times it can be a bit tricky. So understand
that too.
You don't
Absolutely.
have to apologize for that. So what things have you learned in doing this transition that you would recommend people to be aware of, or even help them mitigate that thing?
If you're interested in something like this, I absolutely encourage you to do it. It will always be daunting, it'll always be intimidating, but there are people there to help you out. And if you're thrown into a situation more like me where there aren't so many resources, you're just going to be forced to adapt and grow more as a person. So there's really no negative aspect to taking on a challenge like this. I think a lot of people, they consider teaching English abroad to be sort of like a gap year activity, something you go off to do to avoid responsibility. And that's kind of how it started off for me as well. But through the people I've met along the way, I've learned that it can be anything you want it to be. You can do it for a year, you can do it for 6 months, or you can do it for 40 years. You can totally make a career out of it. So, yeah.
So you touched on just kind of how much you've learned in this whole process. So can you kind of walk us through that? What things have you learned about yourself during this process?
This one in particular, with this move to Spain, it has challenged my ability to commit to something and to see a commitment through. As I said before, prior to my move, I bounced around a lot. I spent one calendar year in the Czech Republic, but that was largely because of the pandemic. I was ready to pull the plug about halfway through, and then I kind of got stuck there. Um, so being in a small town with very little public transportation to other areas of the country, it challenged me to maintain curiosity on a daily basis. And the way I was able to do that was in socializing and investing in the friendships I made there and getting to know people at a deeper level rather than just saying, okay, this town's no fun anymore, I'm going to move on to the next place. So that was the biggest challenge.
Okay, well, so what are some similarities that you've noticed between your new life in Spain and then your old life back in Texas?
The food's totally different. Even the weather. There's a lot of sun in Texas and there's a lot of sun in Spain. That is true, but this portion of Spain actually does have 4 proper seasons, which I can't say about Texas. There aren't a whole lot of similarities at all. It's a very different way of life.
So on your YouTube channel, Tyler Teacher, you highlight some of that stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, I like to address rural Spain. As you said, a lot of people talk about the cities. And the funny thing is, I don't really know a whole lot about Spanish cities. I've been through Madrid a couple of times, but I went there for a weekend in October. A buddy of mine and I went because we felt like we needed to go. And my main takeaway was I feel so fortunate to live in rural Spain because I just didn't feel much of an identity there. I mean, I guess for someone coming from the States, landing in Madrid, it would feel like, oh, I'm in Spain. But for me, it just felt like it's a big city. I don't really know where I am.
Right on. Well, over the course of, I guess, your last, let's call it 2 years in Spain, what's changed the most?
One thing has been the improvement of my Spanish ability. I knew a bit of vocabulary, some words, but I couldn't really string together phrases or full sentences when I arrived. And I can now do that with consistency. I have my days. It's very taxing to speak a foreign language, especially when you work in that language for a large portion of the day, because I work with both primary students and secondary students, and with those primary students, I speak 90% Spanish.
Oh,
So at the end of the day, it is easy to resort back to my native language because it's just not as nearly as exhausting. But it has challenged me to grow in the language. Another thing, and this is something that happens every time I do a move, there's that initial transition period, which is equal parts stressful, chaotic, and exciting. And it's kind of like being thrown out to the sea. Maybe let's imagine we're surfers and we're catching a big wave in Nazaré. It's exciting, but you're also kind of flailing your arms trying not to wipe out. And as I've been able to settle into Placentia in my life here, I've been able to develop a pretty healthy routine where I can prioritize or make time for the things that I prioritize. And I feel like it's actually allowed me to make progress with my creative projects, which is something I haven't always been able to do in the past.
awesome. Well, at Expats Everywhere, we believe that living abroad transforms lives. How has living abroad transformed your life?
That is 100% true. Prior to moving abroad, I was very shy, and I have not been home much since I moved abroad for the first time back at the beginning of 2018. But when I do go home, the main thing people say is, wow, I remember you being so shy, and now they consider me to be pretty outgoing. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but when you move abroad, you're forced into unfamiliar situations and it challenges you to put yourself out there. I mean, when I first moved abroad and I lived in South Korea, I lived in a studio apartment by myself and I wasn't happy there. And that's because I didn't put myself out there. So you learn to sink or swim. And in doing so, you learn a lot about yourself, about the things that are important to you. And it is very addicting. You get addicted to learning about other cultures and to experience as a whole. So anyone who has ever considered moving abroad, I know these days it can seem like there's an additional hurdle with the pandemic and things like that, but I encourage you to at least give it a try because you can always go back to your home country. We learned that even with the pandemic, in the midst of it during lockdowns and stuff, you could still go back to your home country. But the ability or the opportunity to move abroad and have those experiences, those are not guaranteed. So if you have the chance, you should totally take it.
So if you guys want to check out more about life in Spain, click on this playlist right here. Don't forget to subscribe to Tyler's channel or Expats Everywhere. Now let's get moving. Bye.